Right then guys, here I am for another video from me on F1 2019. In this video, I'll be giving you my thoughts and feelings on the career mode and offline features in the game. Before I get into the career mode, there are a few new changes and improvements I would like to talk about first. F1 2019 takes yet more steps forward, and I'll happily say it's my favourite F1 game, excluding the PC games and the PC versions of the older console games. Quite genuinely, it's the smaller and less talked about changes that I love more than the bigger and certainly more heavily advertised changes. Firstly, I love the fact that in photo mode you can move the camera anywhere. In F1 2018 you were confined to an invisible hemisphere area around the car you were viewing. Now you can freely move the camera anywhere around the track, as long as you can drive there. You could do a whole lap of the track with the camera if you wanted to, and that's the sort of lap times I would love to see. Sure, it's not groundbreaking, as Gran Turismo 5, released 8.5 years ago, allowed you to pause races and move the camera freely around, but I'm glad it's now finally in the F1 games. There is a height restriction which is annoying and does mean you can't get the best shots at circuits such as Monaco, or the more bowl-shaped ones like the Hungaroring or the Autodromo Carlos Pache, but it's a small gripe for what is now a great photo mode. On a similar and very minor note, I like some of the shots used for the pre-race intro sequences. They now use less shots of the circuit and more of the wider location, and when you travel to places like Melbourne and Monaco, some of the shots are gorgeous. I've always wanted to go to Melbourne, and this sequence alone makes me want to go there even more. Another minor detail to most, but an important one for me, is that the soundtrack is amazing. Well, for what it is and for what it's for. Whether it's the photo mode or the showroom or the main menu, the music accompanying it is awesome. It's so calm and relaxing, and I think even trumps Formula 1 2001's main menu music. The music alone makes me want to stay in the menus and looking at the cars in the showroom for ages. Speaking of which, I'm sure no one asked for a showroom, and 95% of players wouldn't care if it was removed for F1 2020, but I would. Overall, this game is graphically similar to F1 2018, but the lighting and reflections is where this game has improved a lot. The showroom shows off those graphical improvements, and with the music plus the ability to hide the UI means there isn't really more I could ask for. I also love the attention to detail and how much unessential effort was put into it. I like how you can read up information about all of the teams. I like how the F1 cars are in an upper room floor by a balcony. The sunlight coming into the room just adds to the good vibes this mode gives me. The office in the background and the screen with the animated team logo are all lovely features that place the cars into a real setting and make this more than just a mode of sweeping shots of the cars. The Formula 2 and classic cars also have their own showrooms and their own variations on the showroom music. The classic cars even get put into a realistic and believable location, one where they're shown off and presented as if they're museum pieces or display models, raised platforms, spotlights and photos of the car in action behind them. Okay, sure, the photos are just screenshots from the game, and in most cases screenshots from F1 2018, but they didn't need to go to all this effort. I for one am in awe of the fact they did. One final feature to mention before I get into the career specific features are the race highlights. I like how you can save them for viewing, except there's only a 5 race limit, which really should be doubled. To be honest though, even 10 wouldn't be enough if the highlights were as good as they could be. The idea is a good one, but always going to be tricky to pull off. FIFA has also generated highlights at the end of each game, but I think it's easier to show the highlights of a football match than an F1 race. In football you just look for goals, shots on target or just off target, and fouls that lead to cards or dangerous set pieces. An F1 race is more complicated, with pit stop strategies and people being out of position for large parts of races, and changeable weather can make it even more complicated. An automated system trying to work all of that out and compile the most important moments would almost certainly fail in some way. So the game gets around that by only showing highlights that concern you. Lewis Hamilton could retire from the lead of the race with a car issue, but the highlights won't show that. It's not stupid though. If you cause a massive crash, it will show it, but you have to be personally involved. The highlights' biggest sin though is that it even misses important moments. I did a 3-lap race with F2 cars around Silverstone short. The race was less than 3 minutes long, and at the end of the first corner I was in 2nd place. If the highlights only show things you are personally involved in, then all it had to do was show me passing the leader. And it didn't even do that. One shot I'm in 2nd, the next I'm crossing the line in 1st. It missed the one overtake I was involved in, and it was for the race lead. Now into the career mode, and before I get into the new features in F1 2019, I do want to quickly give my thoughts on what was newly introduced in F1 2018. So here's what I wrote a year ago about the fog of war, and you can pause the video if you want to read it. And here's what I thought of the contract negotiation system. I also loved and still love the inclusion of the team goals as little targets to aim for that give you a big lump of resource points if you met them, and you could alter the difficulty of the goals in your contract, which affected the number of points you get for passing them. It's a simple but much needed feature. I also wrote about the interviews, and I do want to elaborate on that a bit, and that's not because they've changed in this year's game, because they really haven't. In fact, I started off my time in F1 getting asked the same questions with the same possible answers that have the same effects as last year. This is where I differ greatly from the community, because the interviews were reintroduced by popular demand, but I never cared for them to come back. I've just finished a journalism degree, and even I don't care for the interviews on this game or even on F1 2010. On F1 2010 they seem to do nothing except alter what your team thinks of you. If you slag them off, it will lower your standing in the team. But ultimately, on-track performance is far more important. On F1 2010, results boost your reputation, not answers to questions, and it's your reputation level that dictates which teams will sign you. Functionally, it's not that different on F1 2019. I qualified 12th in the Alfa Romeo, a good 6 places above Kimi Raikkonen, but Claire asked me a question about the reliability issue I started the session with, even though it had no bearing on where I qualified. Unless I'm very much mistaken, either answer I could have picked would have had a negative consequence. The one I picked lowered my reputation, and the other one would have done the same, or perhaps lowered the morale of the durability department to make those upgrades more expensive. Anyway, I qualified in 12th, beat my teammate by a huge margin in my debut qualifying session, but because I had to express concern for the reliability of the car, Alfa Romeo valued me less. Instead, the better approach is to refuse to answer the question when it has no positive outs. There's no real repercussions for not answering questions, so why bother? When it's genuinely better not to answer a question than it is to engage with it, then you have to question whether they should be in the game. Now on to the new features which were brought into this year's game, and Codemasters are certainly moving in the right direction. The driver changes are a fantastic addition, and it's honestly one of the best things to happen to F1 games in recent memory. The fact Lance Stroll can end up as Hamilton's teammate is hilarious, ludicrous and unrealistic, but that's exactly why I love it. Speaking of drivers, Devon Butler and Lucas Weber were introduced into the game along with the entirety of Formula 2. I'm in agreement with most that the idea of Formula 2 being integrated into the F1 games is a good one, but the way it was placed into career mode is pathetic. 3 races, 2 of which are basically the scenario mode of F1 games of old. I wish, like a lot of other people, that you could start off in Formula 3, then move up to Formula 2 and then Formula 1. Sort of like how you can move up from Moto 3 to Moto GP in that game series. The problem is the Formula 2 section of career mode has a story, which means everything you do is railroaded to such an extent that it almost doesn't matter what you do. There's always the element of plausible deniability because you see so little of the Formula 2 season, that regardless of how well or badly you do, it is always conceivable that the 9 events you don't see could play out in such a way that you enter the final round tied on points with Devon Butler. If you put in an average performance, but let Lucas pass in Spain, lose to Devon in Austria and Abu Dhabi, you still take second in the championship. The difference between first and second in F2 and GP2 historically is minimal. Just look at the number of GP2 and F2 champions and runners-up that have got into F1. And to Cody's credit, although it does undermine the effort of trying to do well in F2, the difference in offers you get for winning and finishing runner-up in the championship are minimal. So in the first playthrough I lost to the rival driver on all 3 occasions. In the second playthrough I set the difficulty way too low, and won in Spain despite the car issue, finished second in Austria despite the crash, and won the Abu Dhabi sprint race by a landslide and took the championship along with it. I was a part of the Ferrari Drivers Academy in both playthroughs and signed with Alpha in both as well. Here is what I was offered in my realistic but losing playthrough. And here is what I was offered when I dominated. My value was slightly higher, my offered contract was of a slightly higher value, and I got a couple more perks. That's it. That's the thing, we have no idea what happened in the other 9 rounds, but you always enter the sprint race in Abu Dhabi tied on points. So the earlier 2 races do nothing except establish both Butler's and Weber's personalities. The thing is though, is they're not really deep or nuanced characters. Devon is just arrogance personified.
You still couldn't beat me, even with my penalty. So no hard feelings, okay? Not from my end anyway. Chin up!
And Lucas is so compassionate and supportive towards you that he comes across, to me at least, as if he has no personal ambitions.
Fine, but winning at any cost is your strategy, not ours. You better watch yourself.
Whatever.
Even once you get into F1 and you're no longer teammates, he still talks favourably about you. I'm sorry, but top-level sportsmen are ruthless and self-driven people, and I've never seen F1 teammates that are that supportive of one another. In the Canadian Grand Prix when Vettel got his penalty and was storming around after the race, Leclerc never joined in because, why would he? It's not his problem. What about last year when Verstappen was taken out by Ocon in the Brazilian Grand Prix? Verstappen got a bit physical with Ocon, but it's not like Ricciardo came and joined in, nor did Perez go out of his way to stick up for Ocon. Teammates are rarely mates, because every driver wants to win their own Drivers' Championship. Look at how Hamilton and Rosberg's friendship broke down during their time in F1, and I will cut Codemasters some slack, because I don't know if Butler's or Weber's personalities change over the course of a career mode. If they do, then that's great, but it's just a shame it will all be expressed as text. Yes, there's only 6 cutscenes of Devon and Lucas, and in all honesty, it's more like 3 with 2 different variations for each one. The second you get into F1, then all of the story elements fade away except these press clippings. Shame you can easily forget to check your emails and miss them. Even having them appear on the loading screens like News did in F1 2012 would be a slight improvement, because then at least you would have to read them, and it would give the loading screens more relevance to your career. Devon Butler has been embraced by the F1 community and meme culture, and that's fine, but I don't find his character that interesting. He's a very simple character, but admittedly well written and voice acted. You're meant to hate him and form a rivalry with him, but you don't see or interact with him for long enough for me to do that. His character is arrogant. That's it. It's not like Raven West and the Grid games, which you develop a rivalry with just because they're the best team in the game. There's no cutscenes, but they are quicker than every other team in the game, and they don't even turn up to every event. Randomly, they'll appear, and they're programmed to be quicker than everyone else. There's no cutscenes with Nathan McCain or Rick Scott, but you certainly hate them when they turn up and wipe the floor with everyone there, including your own team, unless you give it your absolute all. I honestly think the subtlety in the symbolism of having their cars as the no-nonsense grey and black is more effective than Devon, who stands there and basically says, "I'm easily hateable, so therefore you must hate me." I read an article about Grid on Games Radar, and it summarised Raven West perfectly by saying, if the other teams are stormtroopers, then Raven West is Darth Vader. That's how you form a rivalry. When they appear, you're instantly intimidated and pumped up just at having to race them. That championship will be tougher than it could have been just because they've turned up. They're a team that doesn't mess about and clearly prioritises speed over style, and even have a dash of black, so you know they're the baddies. Also, do yourself a favour, go onto YouTube, find the full mix soundtrack for the original Grid, and go to the 49-minute mark. It is impossible not to have a rivalry with Raven West by the time you get to the final showdown with them and hear this. The annoying thing is F1 2019 almost does the same thing, as you get some good mood establishing music in the Formula 2 story cutscenes, but just before you take control the music fades out, meaning the atmosphere they built up is evaporated before you even drive the car. Lee Mather has said because you form a relationship with Butler and Weber, you drive differently when you see them in the F1 races. If people do, then that's purely psychological, as, unless I'm very much mistaken, their AI isn't different to any others. You drive differently, i.e. better, when Raven West are around as a matter of necessity. If you drive differently when you see Weber or Butler, then that's all put on by you as a player, because there's no need to. But you could use that argument for any real life driver, as there are those that despise Hamilton, and if they played the F1 game they might be dirtier or rougher with him than, say, the driver they support. Ultimately, it's all put on. If you are able to get engrossed in the world and the characters of Butler and Weber, then more power to you, but they were shown too briefly for me to form a strong emotional response when I see them. I cared more for the characters on the journey mode on FIFA, because you spend far more hours with them. They also appear as humans outside of the realm of football, with families and such. Devon Butler and Lucas Weber are written only as racing drivers, and not as people. Again, that wouldn't matter if there were more cutscenes and interactions with them. Also, if there's anything FIFA's journey mode has taught us, is that story modes in sports games, if you want them to be detailed and drawn out, have to be railroaded heavily. In FIFA 17, regardless of how well you do, you will be sent out on loan. On FIFA 18, there is nothing you can do to join Real Madrid at the start, despite the rumours. Then in FIFA 19, at the end of a 40-hour plus story that spans 3 games, you end up in a situation where Alex Hunter and Danny Williams have to be in the Champions League final together, and Alex has to play for Real Madrid. There's very little player agency, as you can't do badly and not end up in the final. It's not like Heavy Rain where if you mess up, the story goes in another direction. If your team doesn't make the cut, you have to load up an old game save and try again. I would hate for Codemasters to sacrifice the freedom and randomness of the races. The one thing I've loved about all of Codemasters F1 games is that they all have a brilliant dynamic weather system, where the weather can do anything. Nowadays there's also the safety car that can come out and turn a race on its head. The AI drivers can even have car issues that cause them to retire, or, in Devon Butler's case during my Australian Grand Prix, cause them to go so slowly that it destroys their race. So he ran out of luck and couldn't even replicate the Raven West form of rivalry by being intimidatingly quick. But I'm glad he was allowed to get unlucky and it wasn't scripted that he would. In Codemasters F1 games, absolutely anything can happen. To me, the story of those games is what happens just from playing. I remember the Brazilian Grand Prix I ran on F1 2016, where the track would just not dry up, and Hamilton won on intermediates despite the fact it stopped raining long before the end of the race. Or on F1 2015, where a concatenation of circumstances saw me finish 4th in that god-awful manner around Monte Carlo. What about the time me and Rio Haryanto in our beefed up manners were both at the front of the Azerbaijan Grand Prix on F1 2016? How about the multi-class classic car races I recorded on last year's game? Sure, I never got around to editing them down into videos for you guys to watch, but all of the action and destruction in that championship wasn't premeditated. It happened because it happened, and there is no story that required or forced it to occur. My favourite video of mine is the end of season montage for my 1 season long career mode on F1 2016. To me, that video conveys a better story than you could ever write. Just look at everything that happens in it. Sainz finishing on the podium in the Toro Rosso at his home Grand Prix. Haryanto getting 7th in a crazy Austrian Grand Prix. My puncture and Bottas's engine failure both at the Japanese Grand Prix, ruling Williams out of the Constructors' Championship. And Rosberg crashing into me after his engine blew up down the back straight in China. All of that and everything else besides just happened to happen. You couldn't write a story as exciting, random and thrilling as that one. If you did, everyone would criticise it for being over the top and implausible. That series produced a fantastic story and it's made all the more special as I know it to be a unique one. No one else's F1 2016 career modes played out in exactly the same way mine did. If you want a full-on story mode, every playthrough will be more or less the same. A full-on story would ruin what makes the F1 games fun for me, the random element. You can't keep full player agency and have a continuous story. The amount of writing, voice acting, animating and programming to do that would be colossal. You'd need a cutscene for every possible outcome. If you want it to start in F2 then it gets worse, as what if Devon wins the championship? The Formula 2 champion can't stay in Formula 2 for another year, so does that mean there's no more cutscenes until you join him in F1? What about if he wins the F1 championship, or if you do? Will his attitude towards you change? What about if you both finish mid-table or down the bottom of the Drivers' Championship? What about if you crash into him or he crashes into you? What about if you become teammates? What about if he has a reliability issue that costs him a race? What if you lost the race in the pit stops or through a strategy mistake? Or maybe if you have your own reliability issue? I know random issues for the player aren't really a thing in this game, but they were in F1 1997, so it really is about time Codemasters implemented total mechanical failures for the player. What about if you make a mistake and crash out of the race? You'd need a contextually relevant cutscene just in case that happens too. That's my personal take on the story elements in F1 2019 and what could happen if Codemasters carry on developing this narrative. If they can produce a story mode that is significantly longer than this year's and doesn't sacrifice player freedom in the long run, then maybe it's worth pursuing. But FIFA showed it's tough to do, and I actually liked the story and characters in those games. People will get bored if every story for every player plays out in exactly the same way. Anyway, that's all I have to say on the matter and on this game as a whole for the time being. I'll make a video specifically about the driver transfers at a later date, and of course the all 10 seasons of career mode video will follow that one. Anyway, until then, I'll see you guys in my next video.